Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome and thank you for attending the last session of today. I'm Andrea Garcia, UK International Head of Cyber Underwriting at RSA Insurance, and I have the honor to chair this panel discussion on the specific challenges and threats impacting the insurance industry. I'm here today with Philip, Cyber Risk Engineering Global Practice Leader at Zurich. Good afternoon, Philip.
Hello.
And Greg, Global Cyber Product Leader at AIG. Good morning, Greg.
Good morning, good afternoon.
And Anubhav, Vice President and Head of Financial Services for the UK and Ireland at HCL Technologies. Good afternoon, Anubhav.
Good afternoon. Great to be here with all of you.
Likewise, a warm welcome to our panelists. It's nice to see you again. Just one point on housekeeping before we start. Please feel free for everyone that is watching and listening today to send all your questions. We will address them at the end of the conversation. Right, without further ado, let's start, shall we? Organizations and their insurers now have to deal with the fast-changing and ever-evolving risk landscape, which has been further intensified by the outbreak of the pandemic. At the back of any technical security testing insurers may have had, and the growing frequency and severity of losses the cyber insurance carriers are actually paying on, the threat landscape is moving very fast. Have reached new levels of complexity, meaning cyber resilience enhancements need to be based on awareness of the new digital economy, but also on the rapidly evolving complex threats. There are always themes or points raised by either by the PRA, the FCA, or any of the equivalent regulators around the world, consultancy firms, or by industry practitioners like yourselves. Anubhav, what will be a good summary of the trends the insurance industry struggles with? And if I may, from a broader perspective, Greg and Philip, what are the major cybersecurity challenges organizations have?
Thanks, Andrea. I think, in general, there is an awareness, cybersecurity is today considered amongst the top 3 to 5 risks that will shape our society, our business going forward over the next few years. And, the challenge though is that whilst there is some level of awareness with respect to this risk, this threat landscape itself is evolving very, very quickly. Every day you hear about new technologies, new ways of penetrating into, enterprise perimeters, etc. And so what that means is that you also need to continue to evolve your own perception of this risk. And you need to be very dynamic in your posture when you are responding to these kinds of risks. It's not enough to have an answer today, because any answer that we have today will definitely be inadequate, maybe a week from now, maybe a month from now. So that's one important thing, to keep in mind. Now, whilst this is the case, it's also worth acknowledging that all of this has not been helped by the pandemic, because one of the things that we are all aware of has happened, because of the pandemic. Even this event, we would have had it in person. We are all sitting in different locations. We are sitting at home, and often our enterprise security postures were not built for this kind of operating model. So suddenly, that's a new dimension that's gotten added, to all the risks that we are facing. So in a sense, the way we look at it and talking to a lot of our customers, some of the big risks that we are seeing that our organizations, our end user organizations are dealing with include, and this is in no order of priority, but social engineering, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. Ransomware attacks have become more and more common, and I think that will continue to be the case. And then the third category I would talk about is, technical vulnerabilities. from outdated hardware, unpatched systems, unpatched software, etc. And the last point that I would make from a risk perspective that we are dealing with is increasingly we are very interconnected as businesses, and so that opens you up to a whole new type of third-party exposure, third-party risks with your ecosystem partners. So that's how I would open this point, Andrea. But really keen to hear more from Philip and Greg, of course, on their perspective.
Thank you very much, Anubhav. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, very good. So I think it's you mentioned a number of very important and the right topics, and I think if we see the reports from the World Economic Forum and so, then basically yes, cyber is amongst the top risks. But I think what you also mentioned, all these technical vulnerabilities, outdated, unpatched hardware, software, and so on, that basically is the result of the fact that a lot of companies don't have that perception. They basically, there is still a lack of perception that cyber risk is a substantial risk. So every company these days goes on and pushes projects forward to digitize business processes, which is generally a good thing because basically it increases productivity and wealth. However, many companies yet underestimate basically that the digitalization of value chains also increases the exposure of them to the risks of the digital age. So fire and natural hazards are very tangible risks, but cyber risks is very untangible. And this is why a lot of companies these days still do not invest appropriately into cybersecurity technology, people, and processes. Like how would you see that?
Yeah. So from my perspective, I'm going to speak from the insurance carrier's role and really focus my comments on the type of cyber incidents our clients are struggling with today. So some of the things that you're mentioning that led to it, I'm going to focus more on the impacts. So when I say that, please hear that statement really more as these are the notices that our clients are sending to us, and these are the types of claims that we're actually paying on. Anubhav referenced it, but these attacks are very significant and can be very disruptive, and talking about ransomware, of course. Globally, ransomware damage costs are predicted to be $20 billion this year, and that's up from $325 million in 2015. From the insurance industry loss experience perspective, while ransomware is certainly not new, it wasn't really until 2018 when there was a growing escalation in frequency and severity being driven by a change in the type of ransomware, really moving towards big game hunting ransomware, and which we saw grow pretty considerably in last year. Just to put it in the perspective of what AIG sees, ransomware claims accounted for 1 in every 5 claims globally last year. Cyber claims, of course, not all our claims that we see. And that's from 1 in every 10 cyber claims in 2018. The demand values with these incidents can be in the tens of millions of dollars. The payments, of course, will vary depending on the characteristics of the attack. Many attackers today are now exfiltrating data before encrypting the victim's environment. The goal to exert additional pressure on victims to pay the ransom. When that situation does arise, those claim costs for those events can be 2 times higher. Of course, when your data and your systems are locked up, there's very likely going to be network interruption and loss of and business downtime, which is going to result in loss of revenue and income. From our perspective globally, we're seeing the typical outages from a ransomware event be about 7 to 10 days. So, I'm focusing my comments on ransomware because that's, I think, one of the biggest issues today. I agree with Anubhav's comments and Phil's comments about, the issues and challenges of tomorrow may be different. But as of today, these are the real events that I think many clients are the impacts of the decisions they're making and the challenges they're facing and what the insurance industry is facing. But we still, like I said, that's incident I focus on, but there's still data breaches occurring. There's still quite a bit of business email compromise attacks occurring, social engineering, where there's theft of data and theft of funds. And we're, the digitization of processes, as Philippe was talking about, where there's no malicious attack and these systems just stop working, resulting in income. So there's a lot of significant impact from the challenges today these organizations are facing.
Absolutely. Actually, cyber attacks have continued to escalate. We have seen in EMEA similar numbers, and companies are facing a number of challenges. I would say it's not just, as you were saying, it's not just third-party risks, the prospect of more disruptive and expensive business interruption, or the increase in the frequency and cost of ransomware incidents. But with the pandemic, they are also looking into digital transformation. So legacy systems and out-of support components are still in use by many organizations across all industries. And these are vulnerable to attacks since their manufacturers no longer can support, upgrade, or patch them. So the threat actors are actively seeking to discover and exploit those vulnerabilities. And although there is an urgent need, the opportunity for technology consolidation and modernization is not a straight forward action. So there is a real challenge in putting security mitigation measures in place. And this actually leads me to the second question. What are the weakest points in organizations today that makes them most vulnerable to a cyber attack? For instance, is it the supply chain, their own employees, lack of access management, inadequate security architecture, perhaps exposing critical systems?
Yeah, thanks. I think all of the above, but I want to go back to something more fundamental. And I want to go back to something that, I want to pick from something that Philippe said a few minutes ago. I think that the biggest vulnerability is stemming from organizational culture. And by that, I mean, are you an organization that accepts cyber risk for what it is? Are you an organization that accepts the fact that this is not a static risk, it's a very dynamic threat, and therefore a dynamic posture is required? And are you an organization that is willing to make the right kind of investments in order to protect yourself against this risk? I think that for me, it all starts there, right? Because if that organizational culture hasn't begun to accept these risks for what they are, then no amount of technology or processes or tools are really going to be able to protect you from all the risks that we are talking about, right? And the other point, that's worth making, in my experience, this mandate has to come from the top. It's not something that gets driven organically. It needs to be, because it's change in the culture very often of organizations that needs to be driven. Right? Now, assuming that this is in place, if you start lifting some of the layers where we think, or where we see some of the biggest vulnerabilities come from, unfortunately, one of the biggest vulnerabilities are people themselves, employees. They are the most susceptible to social engineering attacks, to phishing type attacks, inadvertently sharing passwords, things such as those. So we think that, assuming that you've got your culture in place, the one big vulnerability that is sometimes overlooked is people. Are you spending enough time, money, effort, training them, etc.? The second, I would say, is just the amount of technical debt that we have out there is a risk in itself. The amount of unpatched systems, old hardware and software, a lot of the ransomware attacks that Greg talked about a few minutes ago, you'll find the vulnerability that was exploited was a piece of outdated hardware or software. So that would be my my view on where the vulnerabilities are, how they could impact us.
I would agree. Also, particularly the topic of basically the employees. I think still today Many people think that cybersecurity is all about technology, but it's about much more than just technology. It's about processes, and it's about particularly people. I think the most underestimated factor is a tech-savvy and cyber-educated workforce, because many of today's attacks start with basically people lured into clicking a link or executing an attachment. And another very important topic is basically privileged access. I think basically most of the cyber attacks these days at some point involve weakly protected privileged access in order to basically move laterally from one host to the other, basically find more important targets than a normal desktop machine. And this is also a topic where many companies are very weakly protected. So basically the protection of privileged accounts. And this is where technology can help, and it's also a lot about people and the process.
I'm going to continue my thread on focusing my comments on ransomware incidents and some of the issues we see commonly after an organization has an incident, just a claim. As Philippe and Anubhav were talking about, many incidents do start with an initial compromise of an email phishing a regular user. And we are seeing more and more companies implementing better training on this topic, implementing reoccurring phishing simulations, but getting that click rate to zero is really almost impossible. But I agree with all that. So yes, unfortunately, employees are vulnerable and definitively an issue. But in addition to phishing, and as the others have mentioned, other areas that lead to that initial compromise include the insecure or misconfigured services. Like we hear a lot of ransomware gangs targeting not specifically victims, but devices that are unpatched and externally accessible through scanning. So, while it's unlikely that a company can avoid initial compromise altogether, we really do think it's important that they try to keep their attack surface small and to really make the number of threats that gets to the next level more manageable. Philippe was just talking about this, but once the attackers are in, they do move laterally and escalate their privileges. And one of the things when we talk to our clients, we often hear, and our applicants, we often hear that they're following the concept of least privilege. They say they are, but it really does seem like it's more of a journey along the quest of implementing least privilege. Because after the incident, and admittedly we probably weren't asking all the right questions the last few years, we see large amounts of privileged credentials in use in the organization, or we see that those credentials are being exposed widely across the organization. And one area that we're seeing is there's the over-provisioning of service accounts with administrator access. So, I guess maybe the other area I would just focus on is that, a lot of the clients, not a lot of clients, but some clients we still hear are relying on traditional or signature-based security tools, and signature-based AV doesn't really seem to be effective against ransomware attacks, where there needs to really be ability to detect anonymous and malicious behavior without signatures. So,
indeed. So, Greg, in all the market underwriting meetings that have been happening in the last year, I think we have observed that there are many companies that are just starting their cybersecurity journey, or they're actually within a 3-year journey. And yes, there is an increased focus across industries on cybersecurity education. There's still unaddressed security vulnerabilities that, of course, will still expose important business services to possible attacks. Social engineering, phishing campaigns are still highly effective threat vectors. And also, with the work from home culture, although it seems the focus was shifted from the perimeter security to endpoint security controls, Definitely supply chain and ransomware attacks spiked during the pandemic. So definitely cyber attacks have no boundaries. It's a truly global issue, but I do believe that can be mitigated as far as, companies have the right security hygiene, and they also have a robust risk management. So we actually expand a little bit further on this last point. So as part of the cybersecurity resilience strategy, what are the solutions that are helping most to mitigate the latest threats?
I think Greg already alluded a little bit to what we're beginning to see a lot of. I think if you go back to the point we were making about employees being one weak link in this chain. So I think there is an increasing amount of recognition of that fact, and a lot of investment is going into building awareness, building regular training modules to get employees to identify threats from phishing attacks, from malicious code, etc. The other thing, of course, we're also doing is we're also seeing a lot of is that there is a lot of investment going into access management technologies, which reduce the amount of of the surface area of this risk, and that includes things like privileged access, includes things like single sign-on and all sorts of great things that both for the both for administrators as well as for end users. The second key kind of strategy or the kind of solution or investment area that we see is there is an increasing amount of recognition that artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc., can act as a great ally when you're fighting against a threat which is not static in itself, right? So we're seeing increasingly the investments that are going in technology are, once organizations have got their basics right, they're spending a lot on AI and ML tech. They're spending a lot on building really robust SOC type solutions. They're also, spending a lot of time and effort in integrating third-party feeds into their own SOC so that they have, a view of how these risks are being, manifesting themselves and how they can respond against that. So those are some of the key solutions that we are seeing customers begin to adopt in this battle against cyber risk.
Yeah, and I think I completely agree. And I think one of the key aspects to also consider is that today's corporate cybersecurity management in many companies focuses mainly on the protective dimension. So basically, companies try to thwart attacks, basically make sure that no attacks is successful. However, this is not going to be successful in 100% of the cases. There's always some attackers finding basically segue into a company. And then basically many companies don't have any monitoring capabilities or no detective capabilities. They don't have basically incident response procedures. So they solely rely on protection as their only, let's say, dimension of cybersecurity. And this is a key shortcoming because a high level of preparedness can help to significantly lower the cost of an attack.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, and that theme of focusing less on preventing on every attack, because that's a really challenging battle, and more about resiliency. It's probably just worth noting, we do, at least I do, I think this cyber risk is a manageable risk, even though it is a complicated risk. I'm going to just continue down that thread of things that we, from the insurance perspective, things that we look for when we're talking to clients. Some have came out in other comments, but really looking for strong authentication on privileged accounts. That means protecting those privileged account credentials where they're potentially being exposed. So hearing about having separate credentials for admins and users, hearing about the use of privileged access workstation pause, which we know is not something that every organization can do and be challenging for smaller organizations, but we think there's some really good benefit from doing that. Having a really good inventory of users in your domain administrators group, make it expensive for getting that level of access. And I mean that more as having a robust process for granting internally that level of access and for new users and going back and looking at existing users with that level of access. And I'll pick on the threads one more time, just understanding the service accounts in that DA user group. We are seeing that highly provisioned service accounts being a contributing factor to a number of incidents that result in ransomware. You guys, I guess the part about having a plan, an incident response plan, these things do happen, and so we do like to hear about things that could help lessen the impact. And one of the areas we do focus in is backups and how those are managed. So those are some of the control areas.
Exactly. Raising the standards to better detect, prevent, and respond these events, I believe is also crucial. And organizations also need to make it harder for cyber criminals. So perhaps a layered cyber defense approach will be also imperative. But I think we're also missing one point, which we should also consider, which is risk transfer. So from your perspective, what is the role of cyber insurance within that strategy? And do you believe it should be mandatory?
And we definitely see the cyber insurance market growing significantly over the coming years, right? Depending on what estimates you look at, we're probably that market's of the order of about $4 to $5 billion today, but we expect that to start growing 20-30% annually pretty quickly. So clearly there's a very important space that risk transfer and cyber risk insurance specific have in that area. Now, of course, it is true that this can't be the only solution. Of course, this will be one of the dimensions of the solution as you're trying to battle against the risk. But the one key benefit that we see of cyber risk insurance becoming more and more mainstream is that it will in itself start driving the right kind of behaviors and investments within enterprises. Because insurers are going to start insisting on having a minimum level of maturity and controls that they are willing to underwrite as risks. And I think that's that can only be good for for the industry as a whole. To your question on whether they should be made mandatory, I think market forces will start driving some of these behaviors over a period of time anyway. So I don't think that there is a very big role for making some of this mandatory just yet. But that's just my view. I'm a free marketer by that. So.
Yeah. So absolutely agree. Cyber insurance plays a very big role and will play a bigger role as we basically move into the digital age. Because fundamentally, you only have 4 options in risk management. You can either mitigate risk, basically investing in cybersecurity. You can avoid risk by not doing any digital business. It's probably a bit difficult these days. You can accept risk or you can transfer risk. And to date, basically the majority of spending on cybersecurity is spent for mitigating risk. And basically the market for cyber insurance is still in its infancy. I think it will become much, much bigger. However, it is not going to be a substitute for proper cybersecurity risk management. Basically, companies which don't put in place appropriate cyber hygiene will be having more and more difficulties finding cyber insurance capacity on the market, because basically it's not a substitute for cybersecurity risk management. It's a complement, basically as a part of the risk management toolkit of the 21st century.
Yeah, I agree. And I agree with what you're saying there. I mean, cyber insurance is just a financial control that really becomes really powerful when there's diminishing risk reduction returns relative to adding more technology or shiny boxes or more people. But right, there becomes a point where if you're not making those basic investments and having the right maturity and evolving that maturity as the threats evolve, that cyber insurance will either become prohibitively expensive, you'll get reduced coverage limits or higher retentions. And I think the marketplace today, I know this is specifically an insurance marketplace conversation, but it is a challenging market for those organizations that don't have the right controls. They're seeing their pricing and terms, go up or become more restricted. So, finding that right balance of how you make those investments in technical controls, people, and insurance is super important. And I also think it's a balance that's unique to every single company. The direct question of whether cyber insurance should be mandatory I think it's a hard thing to mandate because cyber insurance is so many different things, by the way. It's really a suite of coverages, and the issues and the impacts that an organization may have, there's similarities, of course, but they're not always the same. And so, to make a mandate, what would be mandated? It's almost, it would be, I think it would be a very difficult thing to mandate and have it to be really meaningful without being kind of the lowest bar denominator. And I'm not sure if that would actually drive the kind of change that you would be seeking.
Yes, that's correct. I agree with all your comments. Actually, I'm going to start looking into some of the questions that we're being receiving, which are mainly focusing on cyber insurance. So one of the questions is, what will a claims process look like for a cyber policy? For example, if my business has been hacked and I have lost a lot of data, how does an insurance policy fix that?
Maybe I'll start, and others can opine. And so, I'm going to just speak generally speaking here, because every carrier is different, and it really depends on the insurance policy you buy. Some policies are meant to be kind of just off the shelf and meant to evidence insurance, and then others are more robust. So it's really a unique decision on how you buy it. Also, the capabilities of every carrier, since you're asking about claims, is a little bit different. Some carriers have in-house capabilities and others use outsourced capabilities to do it. But effectively, cyber insurance is a suite of coverage. It's a mixture of first-party costs and third-party costs. Those first-party costs are really those expenses and direct costs that you incur as a result of the incident. So think of that as you had an incident, you lost some data. What do you need to do? Well, you need to hire a breach counsel to navigate all the different regulations that may exist and determine whether you have notification requirements. You may have to provide credit monitoring if, in certain situations, and so you have to hire that firm to do that. Maybe you have to hire an incident response firm to come in. You need to isolate and contain the incident. And in addition, so if it's data that's lost, there may be liability that rises out, and that's really moving into the third-party side of the house, financial injuries that are caused to third parties and the damages. So cyber insurance can help you navigate all those, and a good quality carrier should have the expertise to help point you and navigate you through that process. Some carriers will handle that in-house, some will outsource some of it. And good carriers should have a good network of qualified experts to do all the different things that I was just kind of referencing: the legal work, the incident response, the contain, the notification, the public relations. If it's a business interruption, you may need to have a forensic accounting firm to come in. And the value of the carrier is that they have this network of providers to help you make a good decision about how to deal with that incident.
Yeah, absolutely. So and perhaps if we expand a little bit further on that, there is another question on what are the limitations of the current cyber insurance, and do you foresee the product evolving in the next 2 years, and how?
Is that me again? So I would say, I think the cyber insurance policy has been around about 20 years. Every year there's a new evolution to it, a tweak to the wording. There's really not much standardization. So I think it's a really broad policy, and it covers more than just cyber situations. So, like I said, non-malicious attacks on your organization, failures of technology, disclosure of just data where there's, or privacy violations, which is really important in this world today of ever complex regulation. I think the one area, and we haven't seen it happen yet, but and there are solutions out there, but it's not as regularly offered, is that cyber risk presents, and we often focus on the financial impacts, but it can result in physical impacts, tangible property damage. And so the standard cyber insurance solutions today really focus on the non-physical financial side. And if you're a manufacturer, if you're industrial control systems, if you have certain thing where you really think the impact will be physical, that's one area where I think you need to spend more time with your carrier and your broker, and making sure that that policy is really doing what you need it to do for transferring the risk that you're looking to get off your balance sheet.
Thank you, Greg. And if we actually expand on that physical aspect, and perhaps this question should be more appropriate for Philip, do you believe or do you think that the risk assessments that are done under the property for the property insurance should include as well cyber? And how will you also address the supply chain element within those assessments?
That's a good question. So I think basically under a property policy, you would generally cover basically attacks which leave property damage, right? So basically attacks which only lead to data corruption, or basically systems being hacked and encrypted, that would not be covered. So in general, when you do an assessment of a property risk, I think you should ask yourself the question, like, what in that company actually has the potential to be hacked and basically leads to property damage, because that's definitely not the case in all of the companies. It's probably the case in manufacturing environments where you have machinery which can break down, where you have basically production processes which can interrupt, and where certain, let's say, materials can then spill or explode even. And I think the property assessment toolkit of the 21st century also should shed some light on that dimension, absolutely.
Thank you. And Anubhav, what is the evolution of the role of the CISO over the last 12 months, the past 12 months? And then how has the pandemic reshaped the cybersecurity function?
Thanks, Andrea. I think, when you talk about the role of the CISO, I think, we talked a little while earlier about how this whole organizational, culture change needs to come from the top. And I think what is happening is that, CISOs are becoming very much part of that change. And so their risk isn't anymore, their job isn't anymore about just protecting, the enterprise against technical risks. It's about actually driving a lot of organizational and culture change from within, within the enterprise. So I think what we're beginning to see is a lot of CISOs playing a role in educating the board, senior management, and enabling and building some of the risk postures of the organization, etc. So we see that risk expanding and becoming more and more visible at a board level and at a management level. So that's one key change that we're beginning to see in the role of a CISO, and it's a really welcome change if you ask us. With respect to the pandemic, it's a little difficult at this stage to say what the world is going to look like maybe a year or two from now, once we've hopefully fully left the pandemic behind us. But one thing that is clear is that hybrid working models, work from home, or call them fluid working models, are going to become more acceptable, and therefore, to how, the whole, the whole point about how do you educate your employees who are now working from home more often, or not working in office as often anymore. How do you educate them about some of the risks that they're likely to see, and as well as how you enable them with some of the technologies, that access management technologies that we spoke about earlier, that protect the enterprise at the perimeter, at the endpoint. I think those, those are some of the key impacts from a cyber perspective that the pandemic is going to have in mind.